Thank you, ladies, gentlemen. Thank you very much. So there's 4 or 5 different places to get more information about formative and other types of pruning. On my website, if you simply Google Ed Gilman, you'll go to my website. We have little cue cards that you can print off. The ISA is most recent, just off the press, about 2 or 3 weeks. The BMP, Best Management Practice, about 60 pages. For more of your reading pleasure with lots of photographs is this little booklet for 25 bucks at the ISA. And this one is for sale outside, and I have no clue how much it is. I think they might have this one as well, if I'm not mistaken. I may have seen that. So there's 4 places in the website, and that's pretty much my best shot. But we will keep or bring you up to date with some examples of things here. And in the States, we call this structural pruning, formative pruning here. So it's the same basic concept. So first, some definitions. The leader is that big thing in the middle. It's typically someplace in the center. It doesn't have to be. It could be any. It's bigger than everything else. That's the key factor. We're just in definitions now. Reduction cut is what I heard reference to a few moments ago. Drop crotch cut, we used to call it a drop crotch cut. We've dropped that expression now, and we now call it a reduction cut. But it's removing, at a union, it's removing the larger of the two and retaining the smaller. Very simple concept. On the other hand, a removal cut or branch removal cut takes off the smaller at a union and retains the larger. So removing a branch from the trunk, for example. Very simple. So those are the terms used in the US, in North America, really. And then aspect ratio. Lots of things have aspect ratios. The word was first coined in first reference I saw to was in the forestry literature back in the 70s, or maybe earlier citations. I didn't go farther back. Aspect ratio on all electronics is this ratio compared to that. Ornithology uses it. It's the bird wing length versus the depth of the wing, if you will. Airlines, same thing. Aeronautics. And so in trees, what it is the diameter of A compared to the diameter of B. So this would be a small aspect ratio, and this would be a large aspect ratio. So it's a very simple concept. So then interior branches, those are typically the ones we leave on the tree. There was a good example or two of some lion's tail trees by the speaker from Hong Kong today. So this is exactly the opposite of that. This would be retaining the low interior branches. And then the periphery branches, this is the pruning zone, typically where most of arboriculture is performed out there. This would be a good example of a well-managed tree where one of the objectives, at least in some landscapes, if not many, is to keep branches, especially those that are going to grow into something like a traffic light, a building, etc., and may have to be removed later. Keep them small by not allowing them to grow long. And so aspect ratio, we had some more time. I would show you some couple of nice videos of pulling apart what we think is a stronger union compared to a weaker union. We don't have that kind of time right now. But notice that when the aspect ratio is smaller, the strength of that union is going to be higher. So various people have done this kind of work. Back in 2004, we did some, and it was followed up by some of our colleagues that many of you might know the names of in the US. So in this particular Acer, the smaller branch on the lower left, it took, in this case, about twice the stress, the mechanical stress, to pull that out than to separate the two codominant stems. And you can put a nice graph to this, how you would read this, and this was in the Journal of Arboriculture, as it was called back then. This would be a small branch on a big trunk, and as we went toward codominant stems, this would be what we pulled was the same size as what we're leaving. Sort of this situation would be here. You notice that the stress to break that branch junction reduced as we went from a small aspect ratio to a large aspect ratio. So this has been done up to branches in the 3 to 4 inch diameter range now. And it's, to me, the most interesting and intriguing part of a tree. You know, here you see some decay that's showing the retained branch cores, and these are extreme. This is probably a conifer of some type. This is extremely small aspect ratio, and you can see why those junctions never fail. So if we look at the history of fruit crop production and nut crop production, at least in North America, back in the 50s and 60s, most growers of apple, Malus, went to the central leader system with small diameter branches or small aspect ratio. So if you go back into the old literature in the 30s and 40s and 50s, most of it came out of Cornell University. And the reason why they went to this is probably pretty obvious. When those branches are laden with fruit, when the aspect ratios are big, they learned that the trees were more likely to fail. So you can go through, this is in North Carolina, but you can go through most portions of North America that grow apple and see this. The walnut, some pistachio farmers, almonds, and some others are also going to this system. Bonsai, if you look at some of the collections, this is Montreal Botanic Garden last year. Many of those, in fact, there were one or two I found without a dominant leader, but most of the 200 and some odd bonsais they have the dominant leader format. Here's a tree, and I just heard today John mentioned this is a couple of blocks from the tree that John spent a lot of time on. A couple of blocks away is this tree, and I'm calling it 700 years. It's probably closer to 600, so I apologize for that. I got the wrong number on that. But this tree is not only hollow, because of the tradition there in Sweden, the king owned the biggest part of the tree. Essentially, you couldn't cut that, but you can keep the branches small in diameter and pruning those. And so there are these just ridiculously looking trees, which are just beautiful specimens throughout the woodlands, at least the parts that I've been around Stockholm. And there are some examples of this knowledge coming to arboriculture. So for example, here's 100 or so of about 7,000 trees that went in to Apple's headquarters over the past 8 years or so, and very trained individual. In fact, one of my co-authors on this little guy right here, his crews went into the nurseries and actually pruned all the trees themselves, or trained very meticulously the nursery staff to prune these Corcus, in this example, to the dominant leader format. And so here we are in the streets of Melbourne, Australia, and you can see pretty good example of a small aspect ratio. They use a lot of plane trees there, London plane trees on the left. So most of those branches, if you look, are small aspect ratio, small compared to the trunk. And then right across the street, literally, so this tree is this one right here. So right across the street from the hotel, downtown, I think it was a Hilton or something, is a completely different structured tree. And so which one, that or this, would you rather be managing along the streets of your community? I will ask you that, okay? Just hope you don't have to answer, but just think about which one. In my view and experience, this one is so much easier to lift, and then people can see storefronts, signs, they can see out, in this case, out of the condominiums. Here, there's wood in the way. You know what's going to hit. The future of these two are going to be nothing but out and then down, and then we have to make a big pruning cut at the base. Seems rather silly in hindsight. So when we prune to keep the branches small, what's the influence of the amount we take off of the branches that are pruned? What's the influence of the amount versus the response? So I want to show you a study, because this was supposed to be practical experience and research, I think is what was in the title. So that's my mission. So we approach this in two ways. I'll show you the trees in just a second. We measured the basal diameter, the cross-sectional area at the base of the stems we were going to prune, where they met the trunk. And then we measured the trunk at the same point. So we had the union. I'll show you a picture in a second. So we measured the basal area, and then we made pruning cuts until we reached the targeted dose. I'll show you that in a second. At the same time, we made this pretty meticulous measurement of the base of the prune branch and then all the areas of the pruning cuts we made out on that branch. At the same time, we then estimated, 2 people estimated individually, independently, how much was on the ground compared to what we started with on that branch. So we wanted to calibrate an actual measurement with how good can people be at doing this visually. Does that make sense? Because at least in the national standard in America, the percentage removed is also based on a visual. My experience has been we're really bad at estimating. There's a lot of variability. I can remember doing it in Italy, and every place I go, and there's usually 100% difference in the answers when we ask people how much is on the ground. So that was kind of a practical check on can we estimate how much was actually removed there. So here are the trees that we used. Tree Fund helped us out over the years, probably a couple $100,000. So shout out to them for sure. So what we did was many of the trees had codominant stems. So for example, we would prune on this one and not prune on the slightly larger one because they weren't exactly the same size typically. So we would prune the smaller one and not prune the larger one. So here's a pruning cut. So we would have measured the basal area where this joined with the trunk down here below the screen someplace, and then added up the basal areas of all the pruning cuts on that branch. And that's how we either removed none, 25, 50, or 75% of the foliage. Everybody know what we did now then? That's pretty clear, right? It's straightforward. So this, for example, calculating what percent was taken off of this branch here, we would add up the cross-sectional areas of all those cuts. There's probably 8 or so cuts there. We would measure the basal area or cross-sectional area there at the base. The pruning cuts are here off screen, up above. Just do simple math, and there's our percentage. So that's how we did it. It's very quantifiable and very repeatable. So 3 years later, I think this was 3 years later, yeah. So what you're looking at is basal area growth. So cross-sectional area growth in the pruned side, and that's the lighter side, or the unpruned side. So the unpruned side and the pruned side. All right, so I lined it up in the same position, so the unpruned and the pruned. So let's do the pruned first. So as we pruned, we got less growth in that pruned side over the 3 years. Not surprising. One thing that was surprising is just how much slower. When you nail it with 75%, you really slow it down. And sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you have to do 100%. It's got to come off. So here the stem that was not pruned, in fact, this was not pruned at all, right? No pruning on this tree at all. So the stem grew a little bit more than what would have been the pruned side, but this was the check, so it did not get pruned. But look how much growth we forced into the leader when we pruned either 25 or 50% off. That was kind of interesting, right? So we're taking away resources from the pruned side, not taking away resources from the unpruned side. So the unpruned side responded by increasing its growth. But when we got to the 75%, we did not stimulate growth. Notice there's a letter B on top of each of those bars. So no difference in, we did not stimulate central leader growth when we took 75% off of the codominant stem. We good? Clear with that? You may or may not agree with it, but as long as we're clear. My mission is to be clear. That is my mission in life as I get older. I don't want to be misunderstood. So here's an example on the streets, right? So there's a before and there's an after. Can you see the pruning cut in that little guy right there? So the recent ANSI A300, the American National Standard for pruning, asks the arborist or the specifier to essentially answer 5 questions. What system are we using? Natural system. I'm not going to go into any detail on what that is right now. I'd be glad to chat with you about it. Our objective here was to subordinate all stems competing with the leader. In this case, there was how many? 1. We're going to pick on those branches and prune only those that are bigger than half the size of the trunk. So you would measure that here, and there you'd visually estimate it. Most people would not measure it. And those are the ones you're gonna work on. You're either gonna remove it or reduce it. We chose to reduce it with a 1/2-inch cut. So very simple language. If you had 150 or 500 trees of that size to prune, pretty simple approach to that. You might have a number of cuts here. You may say 4 to 5 cuts, and this tree would only need 1, but maybe the other trees had more uprights and more competitors, and you want to prune on some of those. So here's the tree 2 years later. All right, so there's the pruning cut. And then 5 years later. Can you see the pruning cut that we made? So in that 5 years, we converted a stem, a double leader essentially, to 1 leader and a branch. So that stem became a branch. And so now you've got a nice lead, and that's how you end up producing this wonderful habit or structure or architecture of the plant. So we started out with a double, we ended up with a single. So here's a crocus. You guys grow as we do. It's our national tree in the States. Take a few seconds to determine, because location is where, location of the cuts. Where are you going to make the cuts? We're not going to say an ounce about how to make the cuts. That information has been around a long time. But where are we going to make them in this tree? Take a few seconds. Takes me just a few seconds. All right, pick a branch. Just pick one. Is that one of them? Is that one of them? Is that one of them? How about that one? All right, what do they have in common? They have a large aspect ratio, right? Very easy to describe. It's kind of a weird word, or call it diameter ratio, branch to stem diameter ratio. It's just longer and kind of messy. Aspect ratio is just shorter, and it's been in the literature quite a while, 60 years in forestry, probably 15 in arboriculture. So those are the ones we're going to work on. We're going to remove them, or we're going to reduce them, or we're going to do nothing. What do you think? You want to remove some? How many going to remove some and reduce some? Nicely done. All right, so I would probably, the way we're going to approach this, there's the after situation on the right. So we remove 3 in the white, and we reduce the 1. So you say, well, maybe you might be saying to yourself, well, that's too much, or that's not enough. I would.
It's on one side of the tree.
Say again?
On one side of the tree.
Right, it's on one, they're all on the right-hand side of the tree. Correct, absolutely. So here's the tree before and after. There we are 1 year later, and then 3 years later. So what we did is we took a bush. You with me? I mean, I'm using that word freely, right? We're taking a sort of a multi-stem developing shrub, and we made a tree out of it. So future clearance now, is it easier now than if we had just left the tree unpruned? Absolutely, because now we can come back next time and lift or raise the canopy as high as we'd like. And you got the branch protection zone is intact because small aspect ratio, gives us a very strong branch protection zone at the base. And so it's a no-brainer for the tree. Handles it, says, thank you very much, sir, may I have another? So we just developed a prescription, all right? So let's go through with the natural system, and that's as opposed to pollarding and topiary and so forth, pleaching. So it's the natural system. It's what we do for most trees. 2 objectives: improve architecture and provide clearance. That's what we did. We improved architecture and we provided clearance, and we certainly made future clearance a lot easier. You can now take a very unskilled person and go out and show them how to make pruning cuts, only show them how to make pruning cuts, only work on the bottom 8 feet of the tree, and they can take those branches off. And that person doesn't have to be as well trained as the person that looks at that and goes, where do I start? And then we're going to work with, in this case, and this number can be whatever you want it to be. It depends on the trees and what they look like and what you want to do with them. But in this case, half the diameter of the trunk. And we're going to make 3 removal cuts is what we did. And there were that many, that size, and then looks like 1 reduction cut. So if you were going to spec this whole median of trees, there's probably 60 or 70 trees there. You wouldn't go to every tree. You'd look at each tree, sort of do a survey. You might even write some numbers down for each tree, how many cuts that tree needs, what type, how big, how many cuts that tree needs, how much, how big, and just do a little sort of timber cruise. That's where my forestry background comes in, right? Just do a little cruise, like 10% of the trees, look at 6 trees out of the 60, and come up with a specification or prescription that would look like that. Standards are great. We have standards. We've had standards a long time in the US, and other countries have for sure. And I applaud the European group for going after the larger, that would encompass 12 countries or whatever it is, 11, 10, 11, I think it's 10 countries, and that's fantastic, but it's only a start. The way we've used our standard is for a vocabulary bank, to use those words and those concepts to write prescriptions. That's where the rubber meets the road in teaching ourselves, our colleagues, our employees how to prune trees, right there. That's it. And one way to look at this is no tree or group of trees should be pruned without a prescription. And a work order is a prescription. You're going out to do work, that's a prescription. So according to the standards that America uses, those are the 4, and there's actually 5 in there. They're combined. Those are the things that we want you to consider answering. All right, let's talk about pruning at planting. Controversial. I'm going to make some people mad now, but that's okay. It's all right. We can still be friends. Now, what I'm going to show you is that many failures and branches that interfere with stuff in the urban environment, all the things we know about building signs, traffic lights, etc., many to most of those branches were on the tree when the tree was planted. Just think about that for a second. We'll see that outside all over campus when we walk tomorrow. So here's why is the branch architecture at planting may not be ideal. So when growers present a central leader to you, and many of the trees here are not the ligustrum, but these other things, I guess I can't tell anybody what they are, right? Because that's part of the game here. And then that thing over there on the right kind of looks like a taxodium, but it's not. That's not too much of a hint, I guess. Yeah, so they've got a nice leader there. However, what often comes along with the leader, and I don't see it so much with these plants in the room, but looking outside we'll see, is 6 to 10 branches that make up the bottom and widest portion of the crown, and those are often oriented in which direction? Sort of like this or like this even, especially at the tips. And so when they get planted out into the landscape, and who prunes trees mostly? Arborists or non-arborists? Small trees. Non-arborists. Non-arborists, agreed, absolutely. So when the non-arborist comes, doesn't know this information, maybe doesn't know a leader from a haircut, they are going to take off secondary branches. They're not going to make reduction cuts. They're not going to go up to the top of these limbs and make reduction cuts to reduce them, I think. And so that's what I mean by the branch architecture not being 100% ideal. It may be good enough, but we got to work it at planting because I'm going to show you what happens. So here's a group of maples we pruned. So we produced these from little cuttings and then grew them up into 45-gallon containers. And you see they've got a pretty good structure up at the top. They've got a leader to the top. But look at all the company that leader has at the top. See all that company up there? In which direction are they growing? Pretty much upright, right? So they are smaller in diameter than the trunk now. So they'll meet a specification that you write where all branches shall be smaller than the size of the trunk or have an aspect ratio less than X. They would meet that spec, but watch what happens. I'm going to shrink that photo down a little bit. It's the same tree, same photo. You plant it in the ground and everything grows because what are the 2 things that were keeping those branches kind of suppressed in the nursery? Two things. The next tree in the line, and here's a hint. The grower, right, the grower. So they were keeping it, because you'll see, if you look there and you look at many of the trees on display here inside the building, you can see the pruning cuts where the growers have reduced so that you don't get this candelabra. Am I right? So they grow, and here's a close-up of this part of the tree, and you can see we've got a codominant stem on a maple. Is that a strong union on a maple? Not in my experience, not at all. I mean, I've gone through a lot of hurricanes, 6 or 7, including one that came 40 miles from my house last week. 2 days before I came here, I almost emailed you and said, it doesn't look good, buddy. But, we've missed so many that I didn't bother doing that. So you can see what happens. These were on the tree when the tree was planted. Those two were on the tree when the tree was planted. And then the trees grow. This is the same genus, different species probably. It's probably Freeman maple or something, but you can see codominant stems, bark inclusions there at the base. Here's a golf course in western North Carolina. Let's take a close-up of that area, and you'll find this. The trees on the golf course are failing. So my question to you is, were those branches that failed on the tree when the tree was planted? Well, yeah. Yeah. Here was my estimate of what the crown looked like. More or less. Thinner at the top, wider at the bottom. So, codon bark inclusion, bark inclusion, bark inclusion. And so this could have been prevented, at least on this part of the tree, if the tree was pruned at planting. Little succotaurs. A couple, 3 little snips, and we'd be done. And I too follow trees, and I'm older than Duncan, so I have even older plants. And this is the 10-year. I should go back to campus. We're probably at about 20 years now, but that bark inclusion, that's the same tree 10 years later. Here you see a partial bark inclusion, a total bark inclusion from here up, and this, my best estimate of that same portion of the tree, and you can see just how much more total bark inclusion has developed in those 10 years. Folks, it's like tooth decay. It doesn't heal itself. Ever notice that? You got to go to the dentist to get it fixed. So suppressing and reducing these competing stems is simple in concept, but people will leave a room and they will freeze outside. And it just takes practice. It takes not all that much practice. You practice on your neighbor's trees, and then you watch how they respond. So you either prune lightly, you're using reduction cuts typically, and some removal cuts. Here we got 3 reduction cuts, a mild and then more aggressive dose. So what would you do here then for this tree? This is a maple or an ash, as I remember. Let's just keep it a maple, because ash you wouldn't ship it anywhere, right? You wouldn't bother pruning it, I guess, right?
3 cuts.
All right, you got a cut or 2 or 3? Yep, something like this. All right, we've got a nice lead after we're done. We've got 1, 2, 3 reductions. There's a removal up there. There's a reduction there, reduction, reduction, reduction. That's a nice presentation now. It's got the typical classic nursery pyramidal shape that people have come to expect. So what was probably one of the reasons why that tree did that? Well, probably a heading cut there. And you can see that in some of the trees in the hallway here. And then the grower comes back and corrects the response, right? The tree responds to a heading cut. 2 to 4 buds, closest to the heading cut, go upright. And we saw that we saw it before the break. Where the cuts are made at the top of the tree in these veteran trees, and everything grows from the top. You don't stimulate lower branches by pruning the top of the tree. So what would you do here for this Quercus? Pretty simple, straightforward. Okay, here's a good way to teach yourself. Just go through the 3 steps. Where's the leader? Where's the competition? Where do I cut the competition back to? So where's the leader? Where's the competition? Where do I cut the competition back to? Those 3 steps. So now notice we kept all the low branches intact here in this wonderful park next to a river. So we got a nice leader there. How about that acer? You got a plan? What kind of cuts are you going to make here? We got heading, reduction, removal. What kind of cuts do you think you're going to need to make? What do you think, Philip?
Reduction.
Reduction, what else? Because maples don't branch a whole lot on the current year's growth, right? So on trees that do that, like maples, we're going to have to make some heading cuts. If you look really close up at the top, you'll see some heading cuts. For example, there's a heading cut. You know, I try to cut it back to a bud because a little dead stub doesn't look great, but it's not the end of the world if you leave an inch or so stub on that, certainly, at all. It's not the end of the world. So research on this. There's 2 studies that would relate to arboriculture. One was done in Copenhagen by the urban forester there, Christofferson. I met him a couple of years ago at the meeting up north here, or wherever it is. Yeah, northwest of here. And then we picked up, in 2014, we picked up a study that wanted to see what would happen if we pruned at planting versus not. So we got 6 rows of trees. You're seeing 2 rows here. There's 4 other rows behind me. And some were not pruned at planting. Another group was pruned at planting. And here we are 1 year later. And if you look real carefully, you can see the reduction cuts there on that row of trees. And so 1 year after pruning, the results were we had better structure. And we lost that much growth. So it was about 3 millimeters of growth. You'd have to measure it to see it. So the trees that were not pruned increased by about 1 inch in caliper. The trees that were pruned were that much less. So does that mean anything to us? No, it doesn't mean anything to us. I'd rather have, I would spend that to get better structure. Does that make sense? So you're spending a little bit of growth to get better structure. We pulled the trees. They're all equally stable. There's no difference in stability of the trees. So we're guessing the root system had little or no influence. So when you make these reduction cuts on, say, a near codominant stem, they're nearly the same size. Here we are 1 year later. See how we changed that? Here we are 4 years later on the right. See how it's the same branch, right? See how we changed that? Now we've got an inclusion because of the angle here. So an inclusion began to develop. But you know, we couldn't help that on this particular branch. At least it's small compared to the trunk. If we had let it go, we'd probably have an inclusion on a codominant stem. And here we are in Oslo. I took a walk. I think, Vicki, you were there too. I took a walk behind the train station. They had a whole row, about 200 trees, Gladizias, Zelkova, all kinds of stuff. Lots of North America, Thuya, and others. And you can see lots of reduction cuts here. So there are people, you can find places on the planet where people are actually doing this, like the Apple campus, for example, with 7,000 trees. All right, so maple. We're running a little short of time, so we're going to go through this maple quickly. There's before pruning Acer. We've got what was the canopy of the nursery grown tree. I'm going to blow it up so you can see what it looked like. Here's the leader, but a lot of friends up there, and each of those friends are going to grow, and that's how this triple leader developed. They all grew after planting. There was technically a leader, but those could have been pruned at planting. Here we are after the first structural pruning. And that's what we took off. Was it too much? Here's another year after that pruning on the left. So there's 1 year after pruning on the left. And here we are pruned the second time. So before and after pruning, this is 12 months after the first pruning. You can see all the reduction cuts up there. Here's what was on the ground. Notice it's a lot less. So better to take care of the situations first and then get the big stuff out of the tree, and then the second, third time. Usually takes 3 times to get a tree that hasn't been pruned. A young tree, you know, this size range and smaller, 3 times to get a handle on the structure of that tree. It's been my experience over a long period of time. So here we are 3 years after the first pruning and another 2 years. So if my math's right, that's 5 or 6 years. So we created what was a developing shrub into kind of a tree. Tree. If you look up in the Webster's dictionary, some other dictionaries, definition of a tree, almost every definition mentions the word a trunk or one trunk. It's amazing. Webster's figured it out. I think we can too. We're arborists. All right, what would you do for this liquid ambar? Sweet gum. You got a plan? What do you think? Pretty simple, straightforward, right? So we could either remove or reduce. We chose to reduce the big one and reduced a whole bunch more. There's a reduction cut, and we got a beautiful leader that's going to make a nice future there for the urban forest. So we got a hold of some money, really big machine, and blew some trees at 120 miles an hour. We had a whole bunch of fun, and here's a tree blowing 120 miles an hour. To give you some sense for what we did, we grew trees from cuttings so they were genetically identical. Some were reduced, some were thinned, some were raised. So the canopy started here, we raised it, and then this is unpruned. So we had 4 treatments, and we had 4 of each, so 16, or we had 5 of each. So we had 20 trees in the study. So what we were mimicking, we were trying to say, okay, how could we prune that tree, or what is the response to pruning that tree in those 3 different ways? And we're hoping that it makes some facsimile to, and I know there's a lot of problems with this, but we wanted to get some sense for what would be the best approach to pruning a tree like this 80-foot liquid ambar. So the first thing we found is we had to find a way to measure dose, because we had to take the same amount of foliage off of the raised, the thin, and the reduced, same amount of foliage. So we measured lots of branch diameters and plucked all the foliage off and weighed the foliage. Oh, that was fun. We squared the branch diameter, and it was a straight line relationship between the weight of the foliage distal to the cut and the size of the cut. And we published this, I don't know, 10 years ago or 8 years ago or something. So it's in the Arboriculture and Urban Forestry. So we would measure the diameters of all this, calculate the cross-sectional area, pull up our fancy big wind machine that was run by lots of horsepower. It was at the time the largest portable wind tunnel in the world, lots of power. And we would pull it up to the poor tree, and we'd blow the stew out of it. If we had time, I'd show you the videos, but if you go on the website, you can see the videos. So there we are blowing, and recording devices, anemometer, and so forth, and up to about 120 miles an hour. This is kind of a key graph. So we had in the trees, we had tilt sensors. So we had 3 of them. And I'm just going to show you the top one. It was about 5 feet from the top of the tree. And it's just measuring tilt. So here's the non-pruned, and this is wind speed up to 100 miles an hour here. I just cut it off at 100, so 40 to 100. There's 5 trees in here, right? There's 5 trees in here. There's 5 in here. You can kind of see this is 3 and there's 2 there, and then reduced. So the way I look at that, and the stats came out this way, this was technically less motion. So this is slope here. This is 50 degrees down here. So these are only going about 14 or 13 degrees at the top, so it's not moving very much. The unpruned trees, this one tree went way down here to 60 degrees. I mean, it really leaned over. And these others were scattered. But look what reduction does to predictability. You know exactly what that tree's going to do. I mean, there's 5 trees in there, so there's no spread at all. They're all on that line. That's pretty cool. Data almost never does that. So here's the 60-degree tilt at the top of the tree. And here's the reduced. So you can see a tremendous difference in the response to that different pruning. All right, let's talk about overextended branches. I wish we knew what that meant. It's a pretty big can of worms. There's no tables I'm aware of. There's very few, if any, guidelines out there, and it's a sense, I guess, that we get, isn't it? I guess it's a sense. So here's the Florida champion of Quercus virginiana. It's about 13 feet in diameter, more or less, 12 and a half, 13 feet in diameter, and it broke. So what we think this research suggests is that reducing at the periphery, working the periphery back, is going to prevent that wood from moving around. And being in a lot of hurricanes and watching trees, literally watching trees break, and I could show you lots of videos in Gainesville and the 2 towns I lived in North Florida. The trees break when a gust comes, and the wood bends a lot. So if we can reduce bending, now we were chatting earlier about the fact that reduction does just what I'm showing you here, reduces bending, and you have now a stiff element here. And you could probably make a case for that creating more bending stress at the base of the tree. But it reduces the breakage up in the crown, in the canopy, and you have a lot less foliage up there. Of course, it will grow back. So when a branch or a tree especially is reduced, that's an in perpetuity practice, I believe. I believe we should at least be considering that. The last thing I wanted to share with you is this tree with one crack, about 6 feet long, with a rib of tissue that's closed over on that side. Target just over here. There's many homes right across here, so we have a target. And so we're going to use the natural system. We want to reduce risk. We're going to work on the 2 or 3 largest branches. We're going to use reduction cuts. And these are the cuts. You can see them. There's one there. And there's the arborist up on the left for scale. So and there's some cuts on the right. The idea is here, and you see the debris on the ground, that the tree's going to sprout and it's going to fill in. We left that circled area. Come back to that in just a second. The tree's going to sprout. More growth's going to be pushed up in the center. And we hope to reduce the likelihood of that lead falling out of the plant. 2014, we came back. We then we're going to work on that area of the tree that we left last time. So we took enough off here. And there's the arborist there. He had made the cut already. There's before and after. It's a 4.5-inch cut. Here we are, 2017. You get a sense for the fill-in that's occurring over the pruning cut. So from these branches here, and there's some sprouts coming up in here. There's another tree in the way here, so it's a little muddied there. And there's a close-up of that. And then here we are, and there's the pruning cuts that we did there. I had the privilege to work with Mark Chisholm that day. That was pretty awesome. So there was 5 years of change in that tree. You can see how the lead is starting to come and dominate the plant. A little bit more like a forest-grown tree. Here we are, 2019. Just a few months ago, we did a circuit out there through California, and where we're going back to the same parks. This is the 5th time we've gone back over about 11 years to the same trees, same parks. It's pretty cool. And so we worked the top. I pointed, Mark did the cutting, and worked the top of the tree, and you can just, because there's a codominant stem up here, and Mark told us that there was a bark inclusion in the top there, and so we made some cuts mostly up in that area. There's 2012 to 2019. So summary then would be typically worldwide we see a lot of this lion's tailing, and Hong Kong showed us a lot there. What we just spent a few moments on instead is going up, making some strategic reduction cuts so that when we have to remove those, they're small in diameter and to reduce the likelihood of failure. We spoke about aspect ratio and the importance of that and how it could be a guiding principle for developing a pruning approach to trees. And we talked about reducing end weight. So I really appreciate your time. Thanks very much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Out. Thanks a lot.